And then Sally, you can take over.
All right, thanks very much, Caris, and thanks very much everybody for coming along today. So I'm going to be talking about the role of population size in the cultural evolution of folk tunes, a project that I've been working on recently. It's really exciting for me, particularly to be invited to speak to a University of Liverpool audience, because actually I did my master's in evolutionary psychology in Liverpool a while ago, and that's where I kind of started my whole journey into this field. And I think Larry actually used to teach me, so I don't know if he's kind of surprised to see me here or not. Okay, so before I start the talk, I just have a couple of thanks to give. First to some collaborators on this project who are also co-authors on the associated manuscript, Thomas Arola and Jeremy Kendall, and to Jeremy Keith, who is the curator of the database that I've used for this project and has been really helpful in letting me have access to it. Okay. Yeah, please shout if anything goes wrong during this. Okay, so quick overview of the talk. I'll start by providing a little bit of context for the research question on the role of population demographics in cultural complexity. And then I'll move on to talk about the case study, which is Irish traditional folk session tunes. I'll talk about some empirical analyses that I've done using an observational data set, some simulations and some future experiments that I'm planning to do next. The project I'm talking about is actually now available as a preprint on SciArchive. If you would like me to send you the link afterwards, please feel free. Okay, so just starting with a bit of context. So one of the key burning questions in human evolution is, why is human culture so much more complex than that of any other species? So by now we know that many species, both vertebrates and invertebrates, are able to socially learn, so they're able to learn behaviours from one another, but only a small number of species have more complex traditions, like stone tool technology in chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys, for example, or songs in whales and birds. But I think it's still pretty fair to say that human culture is just unrivaled in its complexity. So first, simply in its sheer diversity of the things that we learn. But also what's distinct about human culture is cumulative improvement. So the ability to use the products of a previous generation as our starting point and then improve upon it, making cultural inventions more complicated and more efficient. So just as a kind of stark comparison to illustrate this point, although our closest primate relatives, the chimpanzees, can use stone tools to crack nuts, the stone tools that they use today are pretty much identical to the ones they've been using for the past at least 4,000 years or so. And in comparison, in the same time period, humans have invented like mechanized power hammers and antibiotics and space travel and whatnot. So the comparison is pretty striking. So in cultural evolution, we've started to investigate not only the cognitive differences between humans and other animals that might potentially underlie this difference, but also the role of demographic factors, particularly population size. And a positive correlation between population size and the diversity and complexity of cultural repertoires is maybe one of the most consistent findings in our field. Why should this be the case? Well, in larger populations, basically what you get is more innovation, more variation in skill level, and more retention of useful inventions when they do arise. So just to illustrate why this might be, I'm just going to show you a quick cartoon. So let's imagine that we've got two populations. We've got a small one on the left and a big one on the right. And in this population, each individual is represented by one of the little data points. And each individual in this population is able to make a particular cultural trait, an artifact, it could be anything. Let's say it's an arrowhead, for example, and they vary in their skill level. So most people are able to make an artifact of kind of middling complexity. A few people are very skilled and can make a more complicated artifact, and a few people are not able to make something complicated at all. So the first thing you'll notice is that we get more variation in complexity in a large population, and that's always going to be the case, just purely due to sampling effects, because a bigger population means more innovators, so more people to create new things. And also in small populations, they are more vulnerable to the loss of skills through stochastic effects. So if we get random environmental disasters, they might take out, let's say, the top 2 craftspeople in the population who are the best at making arrowheads, and then that skill might potentially be lost forever. Whereas in a large population, you're more insulated from these kinds of effects because you have more people. And also, if people have the tendency to selectively copy the most skilled people in the population who are able to make the best, most complicated artifacts, then what might happen over time is you get the potential for populations to shift towards the more complex end. And so for this kind of like ratcheting cumulative process to happen. So yeah, so that's why larger populations potentially can support more cultural diversity and more complex artifacts. And this is supported by multiple lines of evidence, including several theoretical models, historical case studies, and experiments. I didn't really have enough room on the slide for all the references, but if you want any, just let me know, or you can find them in the preprint. And the main historical case study that people talk about in cultural evolution in support of the role of population size and complexity is the case of the indigenous Tasmanian population. So this was highlighted in an article by Joe Henrich back in 2004 and accompanied with a theoretical model. So the first indigenous Tasmanians arrived on the island around 40,000 years ago, crossing via a land bridge from mainland Australia. And then due to rising sea levels, they were isolated by around 12 to 10,000 years ago. And when Western colonists first arrived on the island, and sadly, unfortunately, really decimated the population, what they noticed is that the traditional toolkit of the Tasmanian population was very limited compared to the toolkit seen in indigenous people on the mainland. So they had only around 24 unique tools that they used, mostly stone. And then ethnographic and archaeological evidence suggests that they actually lost the ability to make several different technologies after they were isolated, including bone tools, warm winter clothing, and quite a lot of fishing technology. And the reason for this is largely attributed to the isolation of their population, which reduces the effective population size, so the number of people, the number of learners basically who are available in the population. So although the positive correlation between population size and complexity is fairly consistent, there are actually some conflicting findings, and previous work has been almost entirely focused on quite a small range of case studies from the domain of technology. And actually, studies of language seem to find something different, which is that although in languages with larger populations of speakers, you tend to get wider vocabularies, so more diversity, you actually get simpler grammatical structures. So they have larger vocabularies, but they seem to be kind of easier to learn. And something similar seems to be going on with folktales. So a comparative analysis from a few years ago showed that in Eurasian folktales, larger populations have more diversity in terms of the types of tales that come from that population, but less diversity in terms of the unique motifs in those tales. So a greater number of tales, but tales that are on average simpler. So what this suggests is that when it comes to language and folktales, at least, in larger populations, you actually get a reduction in complexity because you get more frequent transmission, and with every episode of repeated transmission, you get cultural selection pressures for increased compressibility. So where does music fit in then with all of this? We don't really know yet, because the role of population size and complexity, to my knowledge, has not yet been investigated for the arts, including music. So this is the kind of gap I wanted to fill with this project. And there are kind of three possibilities really for this. First, it's possible that, similar to technology, with music, when you have bigger populations, you have more innovation, so people inventing more tunes, for example, and you also have more skill variation, which is going to include more prestigious players who people might be inclined to copy and then improve upon, supporting more complexity as well as more diversity. Alternatively, you might actually have a negative relationship, more similar to language and folktales, where bigger populations mean greater pressures towards standardization and simplification. So just to illustrate what might be going on there, if we think about the Happy Birthday song, right, that is probably the most widely known melody worldwide. And that's got to a point now where it's basically stuck, right? It's if you turn up to a birthday party and you sing a different version of Happy Birthday, or we just invented a completely new tune, the chances are people are going to just correct you. They're not going to say like, oh, that's great, I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to do that one instead. They're probably just going to tell you you're singing it wrong. Alternatively, music might be doing something kind of different from both language and technology, because there is something distinct, right, about the arts compared to language and technology. In the arts, we kind of enjoy complexity for its own sake, for aesthetic reasons, which is not so much the case for language and technology. But at the same time, work in empirical aesthetics and the psychology of music suggests that what we like is a kind of intermediate level of complexity. So we like enough complexity so that music is interesting and not too boring, but not too much that it's like completely, overwhelming and bewildering. And this is why a lot of people don't really like contemporary jazz and so on. So it's possible that music is doing something totally different. Okay, so now I'm just going to introduce the case study for a couple of minutes, which is Irish traditional folk session tunes. So these are folk melodies primarily of Irish origin, although not exclusively, and they also come from Scotland, England, Wales, and a kind of wider Celtic diaspora around the world, such as jigs, reels, and hornpipes. Characteristically, they are played not in like formal concerts, but in informal gatherings, quite often pubs. And one thing that's really interesting about them from a cultural evolutionary point of view is that they are still performed from memory to a large extent. So they actually do evolve through oral tradition to some. Oh, sorry. I mean, these days people do learn them increasingly from the internet as well, but having been to a lot of sessions myself, I know that you do genuinely pick up a lot of tunes by ear still. And if you turn up with a big book of sheet music, it's slightly looked down on. Like you can do it, but people will kind of think, no, that's not really what we do. Just in case you haven't seen the session before, I'm just going to show you a quick clip. This one comes from Doolin, a village on the west coast of Ireland, and there's quite a bit of background noise as it gets started, but that's actually quite useful because that gives you like a good idea of what the ambience is actually typically like in a real folk session. So I'll just play you a minute or so of this video so you kind of get an idea. Okay, so that's hopefully enough for you to get an idea. I definitely encourage you to come to go to sessions if you can find any in your area. They are really fantastic. Okay, how do I change the slide? No. Okay, so another reason that session tunes provide such a nice case study for the cultural evolution of complexity is that they have a fairly standardized format, but they do vary very widely in their complexity. So that's great for kind of comparing, for like measuring complexity in a comparable way across different trades. So on the screen you can see sheet music for a really popular tune called Cooley's Reel. Don't worry if you can't read music, you don't need to get the point I'm making. So these tunes are generally quite short and highly structured. This one, like many other tunes, is 16 bars long, and it has an A-A-B-B format, which means that there's an A section, which you repeat twice, and a B section, which you repeat twice afterwards. And what you may also notice, even if you can't read music, is you also get quite a lot of repetition of motifs within the tune. So this opening motif is repeated on the second line. And we also have the opening motif of the B section repeated twice in the same way. And we have this other motif which ends both the A and the B section. And that kind of hierarchical structure really helps to reduce the cognitive load and makes these tunes very catchy, basically, and kind of easier than you would think to learn from memory, given how complicated they might initially appear. So this one I'd say is pretty typical in its level of complexity. Some are simpler, others are much more complicated. This one has only 2 parts, but some have 3, 4, maybe 5, rarely more than 5 parts, and they'll have more challenging motifs and scales and less repetition. Okay, so the data that I use to test predictions about the role of population size and complexity come from an online folk tune dataset called thesession.org. So here I just want to thank Jeremy Keith, the curator of the session, who was extremely helpful and very patient with me with my multiple requests for more information and stuff for him. It functions like basically like an online tune library dedicated to the cataloguing and preservation of Irish folk tunes, but it's also a community website, so people will use it for discussion boards, finding sessions, finding other musicians and so on. It has information on over 15,000 different traditional tunes, which are available in over 30,000 different versions. So each tune typically has multiple different versions, which are called settings. And it includes quite a bit of detailed information on the tunes, so the name, the key signature, time signature, and also, crucially, it's got the actual notation of the tune. And they're written out in ABC notation, which is probably not familiar if you're a classically trained musician, but it's something that's used a lot in these folk tune collections. And it's really handy for analysis because it's in this kind of standardized text format, so it's a lot easier to work with actually than sheet music. And crucially for the present study, unlike most other folk tune databases that I'm aware of, they index and measure tune popularity. So what people can do on this website is create a user account, browse the site, and when they find a tune that they like, they can add it to their own kind of virtual tune collection, which is called a tune book. And the site records how many times this has happened. So for example, Cooley's, the really popular tune I was just telling you about, has been added to almost 5,000 tune books. So that's very much one in the core repertoire. So what we're doing then with this measure of popularity is that we're using it as a proxy for effective cultural population size. So what I'm assuming is that the number of people that have added it to their tune books is a proxy measure for the number of people out there in real life who actually know the tune and can play it and can potentially transmit it to other people. So this is something that's quite important actually. So effective cultural population size can be specific to a trait rather than like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a fixed population, you know, like the population of England or something. It can actually be, it can actually vary between different cultural traits, and that's the case in this analysis. Yeah. Okay, so then with some assistance from Thomas Irola, who's a professor of cognition, music cognition and psychology here at Durham, we extracted some measures of complexity from the session tunes. So the first measure, actually rather than complexity, it's just a measure of diversity. It's the number of different versions available for each tune. Also, as a simple measure of complexity, I extracted the length of tunes, both in terms of the number of bars and the number of notes. So I think it's fair to assume that all else being equal, longer tunes are more difficult to learn and play from memory. And then we extracted 3 more complex measures of essentially melodic predictability. The first one is based on melodic expectations. So this is a pretty complicated measure actually that Thomas would be able to explain better than me, but essentially it measures the deviation from melodic and rhythmic patterns that are common in Western music. We also use one based on tone transitions, which tries to capture the rarity of it measures the frequency of transitions between different pitches, and then it will give you a measure that's based on how often the tune uses rare intervals. So in Western music, for example, like big intervals are less common than small ones. So it's more complicated if it uses more big intervals. And then maybe the more intuitive one is a measure of melodic novelty, which is based on self-similarity of the pitch contour. So high novelty means low repetition. And if you get a tune that's very, very repetitive, then you'll get a lot of autocorrelation across time in the pitches, and then you'll get low melodic novelty. So they're all kind of measuring different facets of the same thing, which is basically melodic predictability. And in all cases, high scores means complex and difficult to learn and play from memory. And then I also had 2 measures based on entropy of the pitch distribution. So one based on first order entropy, so that's the distribution of the different pitch classes, and then one based on the distribution of sequential pitch pairs. Okay, so we extracted those melodic features using MATLAB with a toolbox called MIDI Toolbox, which Thomas Irola is the co-creator of. And then we did all the statistical analysis in MCMC-GLMM in R. Okay, so I'll just show you some results, starting with the relationship between tune popularity and diversity. So on the x-axis now we've got our measure of tune popularity, which remember is our proxy for effective cultural population size, sorry. And then on the y-axis we have diversity, the number of settings per tune, And in this analysis, each data point is one tune. And so what we find is that there is a positive relationship. So more popular tunes are more diverse. And based on the fit line, the relationship looks kind of messy, but the R squared is reasonable, I think, considering this is like a cultural data set where there's a lot of messy historical and behavioural stuff going on. Basically the Bayesian equivalent of a p-value is very low, suggesting that it is quite statistically robust. I know that if there are any diehard Bayesians in the audience, you'll be upset by me calling it a Bayesian p-value, but that is basically what it is, isn't it? So you'll just have to object in silence. Okay, so tune popularity is possibly correlated with diversity. And importantly, here we've controlled for the date when the tune was added to the session website. And that's quite important because over time, tunes can only accumulate in popularity and in diversity. So unless you control for how long the tune has been up on the website, then there could be like a spurious correlation between these two things. But we investigate this in a couple of different ways, and it doesn't seem to be, it doesn't explain the relationship. So it does seem to be real. Okay, and then moving on to talk about the relationship between popularity and the complexity of the tunes themselves. This will take a little bit of explanation, so just bear with me. So again, we've got popularity on the x-axis, and now on the y-axis, we've got each of the 7 different measures of melodic complexity. So here you've got length, bar count, no count. Then you've got melodic expectations, tone transitions, and melodic novelty. And then here we've got our 2 measures of entropy. And to make sense of these plots, what I need to explain is that the y-axes aren't actually the original data. They have been transformed so they represent the absolute difference from the median. And the reason for that is that when I was doing some exploratory plots of the data, it was really obvious that we were going to find an inverse U-shaped relationship between popularity and complexity. And so rather than the original complexity values, I used the difference from the median, so it's easier to model using a linear model. So what that means is that as you go up the y-axis, let's say here, the tunes are actually getting both simpler and more complex because they're, well, no, simpler or more complex because they're moving away from the median value. So 0 is the median, higher is either less or more than the median. So what that means is when we get negative relationships like this one for melodic novelty, it means that the more popular tunes are those that are closer to the median in terms of their complexity. And these relationships are fairly statistically robust. There's a little bit of variation between different statistical methods and time periods in the data set and so on, which is detailed in the paper, but it's reasonably consistent. But I must say that the R-squared values are very low. So although there's a reasonably consistent effect of popularity on complexity, lots of other factors must be contributing to variation in complexity beyond just population size. Okay, so just a quick summary of the empirical results so far then. What we found is that popular folk session tunes are more diverse in that they have more versions, so they seem to have diversified into more different versions, but actually they've converged on intermediate levels of melodic complexity. So what that suggests is that innovation increases with population size for music just as it does for tools and language. But the inverse U-shaped relationship between population size and complexity of the traits themselves is something that seems to be distinct to music and might be kind of unique to the arts. And it's probably got something to do with the fact that the arts are less constrained in innovation compared with language and technology. So more broadly, what this suggests is that the role of population size in cultural complexity is not actually universal. It depends on the domain in question. Okay, so as well as some empirical analyses, for this project we ran some simulations because, of course, from observational data alone, you can't find out very much about causality. So what we wanted to do is to simulate some causal processes and then see how that compares with the real data that we see. So to see what kinds of causal processes might potentially underlie the patterns we see in the real data. So this is where I have to thank Jeremy Kendall, who's a fantastic simulation modeler in our department, without whom this definitely would not have been possible, because I'd never done a simulation model before. So this has been something that's been really, yeah, I've really enjoyed working with Jeremy on. These are actually quite fairly simple simulations. Basically, we look at the diffusion of tunes through hypothetical populations. So what we do is we start with a population of a given size, which ranges from 20 to 1,000 in increments of 20 people. And at the first generation, we assume that everybody knows a slightly different version of a given tune, and the complexity of the tune in the first generation, is drawn from a normal distribution where high values mean complex, low values mean, positive values mean complex, negative values mean simple, and 0 means intermediate complexity. But rather than starting the population at 0, we actually started it shifted away from 0 at 3, and that could have been any value, but we just wanted to start it somewhere other than 0 so that we could potentially allow the populations to move towards 0, which here indicates intermediate complexity. So then in all subsequent generations, each individual in the population will either copy the tune of somebody else with a small probability, or make an alteration to their own tune, again with a small probability, or they'll keep their original tune without making any changes. So we kept these probabilities fairly low because we assume that folk music is, well, it is kind of by nature quite a conservative tradition. So there's more emphasis on like preserving traditional tunes rather than like radical innovation all the time. And then we explored the effects of different social learning processes and population structures in 4 conditions with a 2x2 design. So first of all, we varied the social learning process. In some conditions, we had unbiased social learning. So when the individuals socially learn, they don't copy other tunes with like perfect fidelity. There's a small amount of error when they copy, which is reasonably realistic. You know, we don't expect people to perfectly copy tunes that they hear. And in the unbiased learning condition, that error is random and it's centered on 0. So the tune will change a little bit when they learn it, but it won't overall it won't go in any particular direction in terms of complexity. Whereas in the biased learning condition, what happens is that error is biased towards 0. So if you are copying a simple tune, then the error will be slightly biased in a positive direction. So the version of the tune you learn will be slightly shifted towards 0, and vice versa. If you copy a very complicated tune, the version that you learn will be slightly simpler, so biased again towards 0. And then we also varied the population structure. So in the global social learning condition, we assumed a totally homogeneous population, where when you socially learn, you just randomly choose somebody from the population and you learn from them. Now it's a fully interconnected population. Whereas in the local condition, instead of selecting anybody at random from the whole population, you choose somebody from the 10 people in the population who have tunes that are most similar to your own. So to mimic kind of population substructures. And 10 is like a reasonable number of people that you might see at a local session. So I kind of had in mind like these are like local populations within a wider population of folk musicians. Okay, so I'll just walk you through some results. So on the x-axis now we've got population size varying from 20 to 1,000, and then on the y-axis we're going to have different measures of complexity. And so all of these are from the end of an individual simulation run with a population of a given size and in a given set of learning and population conditions. So let's start with diversity. So now on the y-axis we've got the number of unique settings in the population at the end of each run. And what you can see is that this increases linearly with population size. And this isn't really surprising because if you just have a constant rate of innovation, as the population size gets bigger, you're just going to get more innovation. That's basically just always going to happen just purely due to statistical, sampling effects. Also, what happens is that with bigger populations, you get more variation in complexity. So now on the y-axis, we've got the standard deviation in complexity. And this is true across all of the conditions, although you get something slightly different going on when you allow for local population structures. And I think what's going on there is you'll get diminishing returns as the population size gets bigger, because I suppose what matters more is the local population size. And that's going to be determining the complexity much more than the bigger population size. So I guess that's why that's happening. Bigger populations have more diversity and more variation in complexity, although some diminishing returns when you allow for local population structure. But the interesting thing is that although variation in complexity in absolute terms increases with population size, it actually decreases when you look at the amount of complexity relative to diversity. So although bigger populations have got more tunes, there's less variation than you'd expect given the number of tunes, suggesting that larger populations are actually like converging on a smaller range of variation in complexity than you'd expect given just purely sampling effects, basically. And this is particularly pronounced when you allow for local traditions. So to explain, maybe to make this a bit clearer, I'm just going to show you the results of one individual simulation run across all of the conditions and comparing a smaller population with 100 individuals on the top row and a bigger population with 1,000 individuals on the bottom row. So now on the x-axis, we've got the time steps. We start at time point 1 and then run to time point 5,000. And then on the y-axis, we've got the complexity score. And now each data point on the screen is an individual within those simulated populations. So what you'll see happening is that we start with our normal distribution of complexity centered on a mean of 3 here and here. And then over time, as traditions start to form due to social learning, the variation is reduced. But then because there's innovation, you also then get some new variation. It doesn't just stay totally constant over time. There's a bit of kind of wobbling around, but there's no direction to the change because the learning is random. So populations will start centered on a complexity mean of 3, and then they'll end pretty much on the same thing. And that's true both for small and large populations. So over time, variation reduces as the populations converge. Again, not unexpected because here we have global social learning, so the variation is actually going to collapse to fewer numbers of traditions. And the larger population actually is able to sustain more variation over time in absolute terms than the smaller population. So then what happens if we introduce biased copying? Well, as you might expect, it's kind of the same, except that over time the populations start to move towards 0. And of course, the rate that they change is up to the strength of, it's up to you as the modeler. You know, you can change that by changing the strength of the intermediate copying bias. If you have random copying with local traditions, what happens is you basically get completely insulated local traditions, so there's no jumping between them, and this effectively sustains variation over time and stops it declining, which is quite interesting. So this kind of illustrates how homogenization of populations like eliminates cultural variation, which is kind of an interesting thing, and you know, for many reasons. And then if we allow for both local traditions and bias copying, then you get these local traditions forming that sustain variation to some extent, but then over time they start to get overridden by this like strong drive towards tunes of intermediate complexity. So in all cases, larger populations sustain more variation, but in some conditions they will lose more because they have more to begin with. So particularly when copying is biased and when you have local traditions, there's a bigger loss in the bigger populations than the smaller ones. Okay, so just a quick recap of the simulation results. Innovation rate increases linearly with population size, pretty much just due to sampling effects. It's not really surprising. Again, not unsurprisingly due to sampling effects, larger groups can sustain more variation in complexity in absolute terms, but they sustain less variation in complexity relative to the number of tunes in the population because of the greater effects of convergence due to social learning. And in some conditions, at least, larger populations have more variation to lose over time than smaller ones. Okay, so just before I finish, I'll tell you briefly about some future work that's in the pipeline. So obviously you cannot draw very strong conclusions about causality from observational analyses. That's part of the reason why we did the simulations, is because we wanted to see, well, do you get, you know, are our causal explanations kind of plausible based on the data we have? And I think the simulations suggest they are, but a stronger test of the hypothesis that larger populations favour intermediate complexity levels in music would be an experiment. So that's the plan next. I'm going to try transmission train experiments using folk musicians with varying group sizes. I've done a pilot study just to show kind of proof of concept. It's quite difficult, but it is doable. This one just used 8 folk musicians, whistle players in particular, 2 chains of 4 musicians each, started by me, playing a tune that was generated by AI, which is quite cool because that means you know that they can't possibly have known the tune already. And they were amazingly realistic, actually, the AI tunes. Like I don't think anybody twigged that they weren't real, which is quite spooky. So this shows you some just very preliminary results. On the y-axis, we've got a measure of melodic novelty based on self-similarity. So high means less repetition, more complex tunes. Low means more repetition, less complex tunes. The different colours represent different levels of complexity of the input tunes. So the tunes that I played in the first generation were varied between simple, intermediate and complex tunes. And what is kind of interesting, at least if I take these results at face value, is that there doesn't seem to be a decline in complexity over time, which is really unusual for a transmission chain study. So usually what happens in a transmission chain study where you ask people to, copy the previous person, then they copy them, and then they copy them, and so on, is complexity just crashes, like it declines very quickly. And this is true in studies of language and I think technology as well. And you get things becoming simpler and more repetitive quite quickly, but that didn't seem to be happening here. So that's really intriguing, and I didn't expect that. So yeah, I'm really interested to dig more into that and find out exactly what is going on there. Okay, so that's about it from me just now. So what I've shown is that population size, what this result shows together with some previous work is that population size does not actually always increase cultural complexity, rather the effect is domain dependent. What larger populations do is increase the variation in the trait and therefore the potential for selection. But the actual value of complexity that a population converges on, I don't think is predictable just based on population size. It depends on the domain. So it depends on things like people's aesthetic preferences and local features of the environment and so on. So much like kind of classic population genetics models, really, large populations mean greater potential for selection, but you can't predict the direction of phenotypic change unless you know something about the environment in which the individuals are adapted to. Music seems to be doing something different from both language and technology, I think largely because of less constraint on innovation in the arts as compared to language and technology, where functional concerns dominate. And so what I hope I've shown you more broadly is I think that music can make some fantastic contributions to cultural evolution and vice versa, particularly folk session tunes, which are a kind of overlooked topic of study by multiple disciplines. All right, thanks very much for listening. Very happy to take any questions. I'm going to sit down as well.
Right, so Sally, do you want to just stop your screen share and then we can move on to the Q&A?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so does anyone want to ask a question? You can either raise your hand or you can just put it in the chat. So James Coxon has put in the chat that he has a question. Do you want to unmute?
Hi, Sally.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Sally. Very interesting. Thanks, Sally. A lot to take in, so if I've missed something, please excuse me. Have you looked at individual or subdividing the populations into how many tunes each individual has in his or her tune book as a proxy for skill level? I was thinking along the lines of the more tunes somebody has in the tune book, you might think they've been playing longer or pick up tunes better. I'm just wondering if you've thought about that.
That's a really good suggestion. I would really like to look at something like that, because I bet you do have what we would call in cultural evolution like prestige bias effects.
Yeah.
People are more likely to be influenced by prestigious players. I bet that's true. The way the data is formatted won't let me get that because I can't get like individual level data as far as I know from the sites. I might be able to actually. I can potentially ask the curator about it. It's basically at the moment it's structured. It's per tune rather than per individual. But what I can get is how many tunes people have uploaded, I think. So I might be able to get something along those lines. But the data's not in the ideal format for looking at that. But yeah, that's a really good suggestion. That is something I would like to investigate further. Thanks, Jim.
The other thing is, every week the suggestions of tunes come up. There's so many works, I use it as well, obviously.
Yeah.
As you know. and I often pick up a tune that's been suggested, especially one I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
So that could have an effect as well. I don't know how you'd control for that. That'd be really quite.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. Is that it's definitely not exclusively an oral tradition. So people do learn it by ear, but also people will listen to a tune and say, "What was that?" And then someone tells them, and you go and look it up on the sheet music. So it's not, yeah, it's definitely not exclusively an oral tradition. It's both. Yeah, tunes are transmitted both through oral tradition and digitally. So it's a little bit complicated, I think. And it's there's not really any way to know exactly how people are learning without like a detailed observational study, but that would be really nice.
Right, thanks, Sally. Thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation. I was fascinated to read more or learn more about it.
Brilliant. I'll see you at the elm tree.
Yeah, okay, Sally.
Okay, so Alberto, you have a question as well?
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yeah, it's very interesting. I was thinking, so there are some modeling results that show that when there is bias transformation, instead of selection and copying, you would not expect a relationship between population size and complexity. So there was a Alex Mezzudi paper in a few months ago. I was just wondering if you consider this. So the idea would be if in the case of songs, some form of songs are kind of easier to reinvent by yourself. So if it's both a copying and bias transformation process, you would expect something like this. Is something that maybe can be added in your simulation or...
Oh, okay. So are you saying that if the bias is strong enough, then you won't get increased variation with bigger populations?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need a bias toward intermediate complexity. You can just have a bias that suggests that some kind of songs, say, have optimal features, like cognitively optimal or whatever you can think. And then you can imagine that this optimality is independent from complexity.
Okay.
Because depend on something else. So some can be simple, some can be complex. So this should not constrain your simulation. But then if there will be some bias transformation that point toward these optimal songs, I think you would expect that at least would be as stronger is the bias transformation, as lower should be the relationship between population size and complexity. I don't know if I explained myself, but
I'll have it if you get a chance. Could you send me the Mezzudi model and I'll have a look in more detail, because that sounds like that would be important to think about.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So Susan Morrow has put in the chat that this looks like it'd be a useful study to repeat using other music from other cultures, for example, blues, to see if there is correlation in the results. Yeah,
I completely agree. So without like some sort of cross-cultural study, I can't make any claims about universality of these findings. I can't say like, oh, the preference for intermediate complexity is universal across folk music, or this is how all folk music behaves. I suspect it might be quite widespread at least in traditions that are largely orally transmitted, just simply because of like widely shared memory limitations, right? That we can't, there's a limit on how complex tunes can be if they're orally transmitted, and at the same time we also share this it's quite a widespread preference to like want music that's sort of stimulating and interesting. But yeah, I don't think it would be the same across all contexts. So with blues and with jazz, for example, there seems to be like a very strong pressure towards like very complicated like solos and improvisation and so on. So you may well get something really different, I think, than in folk music, where innovation is kind of, it's sort of, a bit of it is kind of encouraged, but not too much. Like it's not really about like individual players like showing off and being flashy. It's more like it's more about everybody sort of playing the tune together and enjoying that together. So yeah, looking at different contexts, I think would be great. And I wouldn't expect these results to be universal across different genres of music necessarily, but possibly across oral traditions, maybe. Thank you. Interesting. Thank you.
Larry, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Sally. Thank you for opening my eyes to an amazing data set. I would have never thought of this, but I think I want to take you right back to the very beginning when you started with Henrik and the Tasmanian model, because this is something that really interests me, is the loss of diversity and expertise. So I was wondering, there've been critiques of the Henrik model in terms of how the data has been presented, the modeling used, but I thought with your data set, could you construct isolation experiments and see the role of the prestige player, the removal of prestige players, what happens over time in terms of whether it converges onto some level of complexity that's minimal to be effective? Was it basically taking some of Henrik's predictions and apply them to this new data set from my perspective?
Yeah, potentially, yeah. So I think similar to following on from what I was saying in response to Jim's question, I think prestige probably is really important, and it's something I should try and look at, because what I suspect is that there will be cases where that's more important than population size. Is that everybody will, like, if there's some fantastic player, right, and they turn up, I think that's the importance of that is going to be greater than population size, because everyone's attention is going to be like drawn to this player, and they'll be trying to copy what they're doing, and quite often they're prestigious because they're playing something that's more complicated. So that's what kind of draws people towards them. So I think, yeah, it sounds like looking at the impact of prestige would be really important. It's a little bit difficult given the format the data is in at the moment, because it's quite hard to link up people with tunes just because of the kind of architecture of this particular data set. But that would be something I think I definitely should look at. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I was thinking not so much from this data set, but from your future plans. Yes, that would be good, because then we'll have more control. So yeah, I was wondering about looking at prestige actually. I was wondering about how best to measure it. I mean, I guess I could use just a number of years of experience or something like that, because just observation, just anecdotally from kind of eyeballing this data, I definitely saw some cases where you'd have very, very skilled players and the tune was quite stable, and then somebody would come in who was less confident, and then it would kind of crash, and then interestingly it came back up. It kind of a new one then got invented to sort of fill its place, and the complexity stayed quite constant, but it was actually kind of a different tune from where we started. So yeah, in the experiments, I think that would be something that we definitely can look at actually. And I think probably you need both those things, I'd imagine, to keep complex tradition stable, is both enough prestigious players to kind of keep everybody going, and then a big enough group size to like guard against the loss of skill. I would wager, but that's what I want to try and confirm with experiments. Okay, I'll keep watching. Thank you.
Matt, you've got your hand up as well.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Sally. This is really interesting stuff, and I really like the approach of sort of attempting to get at causality via the sort of simulations afterwards. I was interested in the sort of wider implications of the distinction between local and global transmission, and the sort of possibility of local transmission sort of being important to maintain diversity. But I'm just wondering whether you could have almost like an intermediate state in the simulations where, to me, if people are copying the sort of 10 most similar individuals, it's a bit like the sort of old Axelrod model and that sort of leads automatically towards a certain degree of canalization or polarization, where people get stuck in their little groups and just get more and more similar within groups. I wonder if there will be some kind of intermediate way that you could have people moving between groups, or have effectively a migration parameter or something. So you could go for something more like the kind of what people are calling the partial connectivity situation, because I wonder if that might allow you to both maintain, I just wonder if the results would both maintain diversity and prevent this kind of canalization into little polarized subgroups.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think it's probably a bit crude, just having like literally like I only learn from these 10 people and like no one else is important. Yeah, I think it'd be much more realistic to have, like you were saying, a sort of gradation and a kind of network where you like vary the connectivity and the clustering. Yeah, that's definitely something we could look at. yeah, that's a really good idea actually. I will have to learn more about networks. Yeah, that would be really cool. Thank you.
Because I guess there's nothing in your model that actually says they always have to interact with the 10 people, but I suspect that will happen because people just get more similar.
Yeah, so our model is so simple that really there's no like separate behavior apart from copying and complexity, right? They're not like moving around in their groups, and then also there's complexity going on top of that. Like the complexity defines their group basically, so they group according to the complexity. It probably could be more sophisticated. You could probably allow for people like assorting on other things, because in reality, like you don't seek out people who have tunes most similar to yours in their complexity. You go to a session with whoever's in your local area, and then that creates your local tradition. So yeah, there is definitely something more complicated we could do. I think with models, there's always a question about like how complex and how realistic you need to make it to kind of, and that sort of trades off against like generalizability, right? So there's always kind of a bit of a trade-off. I think like there's definitely many ways in which we could make it more realistic. It's difficult to know when to stop, I think, with that. Yeah, it's something that's quite new to me actually. But yeah, that would seem like a sensible thing to do. I agree. Something I definitely, we'll think about. Thank you.
Could I also just ask you to pop the SciArchive link in the chat?
Yes. Yes. Let me just find it. Sure. Okay, there you go.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Bruce, your hand is up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A kind of fascinating topic. One of the things about folk music is that very often the tunes are modal. Is there any possibility that you could, as it were, that one could, as it were, look for data around that and how that ties in with this, the preferences for particular modes?
Yes. Yeah, certainly. So yeah, you definitely could look at the popularity of different modes on the website. It wasn't really a focus of the current study, but that's certainly something, if you had a particular reason to think that some modes are more popular than others, that's definitely something you could test. Like I suspect what you'd find is that modes that are like easier to play will be more popular. You can also look at time signatures. So you'll probably find like, you know, time signatures of like 7, 8 and so on are probably less popular than like 6, 8 and so on. Yeah, so that's definitely something you can look at, although I didn't really have a specific reason to do it for this project, but it's, yeah, certainly possible.
Thank you.
And Daniel, your hand's up as well.
Hi. Do you think the nature of the TuneBook database being online would at all bias the popularity of the songs away from maybe the older generations that are less likely to use that result?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Very good question. The session is quite widely used. My impression is that the demographic at folk sessions is not that young typically. And anecdotally, I'm not sure that the use of the session is limited to younger players, although I don't have data to back up that impression. The session website itself is quite old in internet terms, like it was established in 2001, so it's been going quite a long time. So I suspect actually the age range on it is higher, is older than you might expect, but yeah, that is a good question. You will get people who just don't use it at all, just only learn by ear. So yeah, I don't have data on that unfortunately, but yeah, that may well. Yeah, it's hard to say without data. Sorry, I'm just speculating. Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
Okay, so we have time for one more question if anyone wants to ask.
I could happily ask questions for
Go
some
ahead,
time.
Matt.
Don't mind. The other thing I find intriguing, going back to the Henrik model, is that people always focus on, and again, it's a very simple but powerful model. People always focus on the fact that a bigger group size increases the skill level or whatever his variable is. But if you look at the structure of that model, the other way that you could increase skill level is by making everybody really bad at copying, which is really intriguing, because making everybody really bad at copying will increase the variance.
Yeah.
And that will then increase the skill level at a population level.
Yeah. Yeah, because then you'd assume that people, when they make copying errors, they might accidentally invent something really good that's really complicated. I guess it's how likely we think that is, I suppose. Like, yeah, how likely is it you just stumble? I guess the history of inventions tells you that does happen quite a lot. Yeah, that does seem but that does seem kind of paradoxical, doesn't it? That like by making people like really poor copiers, you could increase the complexity. Because I think in reality people are quite strategic with their copying. Like,
yeah,
not sure.
It's just I think the issue is that if you think of it by analogy with genetics, actually a higher mutation rate would be beneficial for the population, but it won't evolve because it's detrimental to all individuals. Yeah. So you've got that tension. Yeah. Yes, I guess that depends how much you think cultural group selection is going on, which is not something I'm confident enough to wade into. But, yeah. Sorry, just wildly speculating.
Right, okay then, so I guess we can go ahead and finish there then. Thank you, Sally, that was really interesting, and thanks everyone for joining and asking questions. I hope to see you all back next week. We will be having Paige Madison give a talk on the history of the characterization of the Neanderthals, so that should be really interesting.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.